Samantha had never known what it was like to have a real family. At 13, she had been through more foster homes than she could count. None of them made her feel at home. That was until the Larkins came into her life. Ryan and Mark were different from all the other foster parents she had ever known. They were kind, always smiling, and Samantha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She was finally adopted, and with that a new life opened up before her. The Larkins' house was simple but cozy. It had an open kitchen with light wood furniture and a table where there was always an empty chair for her, as if she had always belonged there. It was the kind of house Samantha saw in movies and wished for herself. When Mark took her to her new room with lavender-colored walls and a fluffy carpet, Samantha felt a pang of relief. She couldn't believe what was happening. "This is your space now, Sam, if you need anything. Just call," Mark smiled, and for the first time in a long time, she believed she might finally have a place to call her own. At first it seemed perfect. The Larkins were welcoming and wanted her to know that she was safe there. Ryan, the calmer of the two, always made breakfast with pancakes and scrambled eggs, while Mark, the more energetic one, organized the house and took care of the small details. They made a good couple in Samantha's eyes, and it seemed like she fit well into this new reality. However, little by little, something began to change. It was as if an invisible weight was forming in the walls of the house. Something Samantha didn't understand at first, but that made her feel uncomfortable. Mark, the more active father, started to seem less warm. The smiles, which used to be spontaneous, began to disappear, and in their place intense and tense looks appeared. Sometimes Samantha would hear quiet arguments between the parents, but she could never make out what they were saying. She knew that at first this was normal in any family, but the atmosphere was shifting. One Friday afternoon, when Mark entered the living room, something was different. He was more tense than usual, with his hands clenched by his sides and his gaze fixed. Samantha was sitting on the sofa watching TV when he called her. "Samantha, come here now." She stood up, not knowing what to expect. Mark had never called her like that with such a harsh voice. When she got close to him, he pointed to the books scattered across the table. "This isn't a joke. I want to see you focus more on school and less on nonsense. You need to understand that rules are important," he said, his voice low but heavy with strange tension. Samantha swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond. She was just trying to adapt, but what he was saying felt more like a shout. I was just resting for a bit, Dad," she tried to explain. But something in Mark made her shrink. He shook his head. "Rest? Or do you think you're going to get anywhere in life by just resting?" His tone became louder and sharper. "You need to try harder, Samantha, if you want to be someone. I can't give everything to you on a silver platter." The impact of his words made Samantha pull away, feeling the weight of a responsibility she never asked for. In that moment, she felt a thin line of fear rise within her. She didn't know what was happening, but something inside Mark seemed to have changed. He was no longer the warm father who greeted her with a smile. Something had taken him over. "Sorry, Dad, I'll try," Samantha whispered, trying to understand what had just happened. But Mark didn't respond. He simply turned and went to the other side of the house, leaving the tension in the air. Ryan, the other father, appeared shortly after, noticing what had happened. "Hey, is everything okay?" "Samantha?" He smiled kindly, trying to ease the tension, but Samantha knew she couldn't hide what had happened. The atmosphere in the house was becoming denser, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself that this was just a phase, the fear she felt began to grow in her chest. Little by little, Samantha began to notice the subtle change in Mark's behavior. The outbursts of anger seemed to happen without warning, with small accusations, stricter rules. Meanwhile, Ryan found himself trying to protect Samantha, defending her from his partner's outbursts, but the division between the two fathers began to create an even greater distance. Samantha was caught in the middle of an emotional struggle, torn between the two men she should call fathers. She wanted to love both, but her relationship with Mark was becoming increasingly difficult to handle. And worse, she didn't know how to deal with this change within herself. It was as if her hope was being deconstructed day by day. And as the tensions grew, Samantha knew she couldn't escape forever. Something had to change. What she didn't know was that the change approaching would be greater than anything she had ever experienced in her life. What had started with promises of a new life soon turned into something more complex and frightening. Samantha, still with her heart full of expectations, began to feel like a prisoner of the rules Mark imposed. Rules that seemed to grow like a shadow, taking over every corner of the house. Mark, unlike Ryan, had an aggressive way of showing love. Samantha couldn't understand how a father could be so rigid with her, demanding perfection at every step. His vision of what a good daughter should be seemed distant from the image of warmth she had dreamed of. With every small mistake she made, with every soft word she let slip, Mark's gaze became heavier. It was as if he was measuring every move she made, expecting her to fit into a mold he had created. At first, she tried to fight against it. She tried to resist the low shouts and the bursts of anger that followed any slip-up. But she soon realized that the arguments with Mark began to drag on more and more, and she felt more and more helpless. In his outbursts, he seemed to forget that she was a child, a girl who was just trying to find her place. It wasn't just the harshness of his words that hurt, but the coldness with which he began to ignore her feelings. And when Mark stepped away, it was Ryan who tried to ease the pain she felt. Ryan, the calmer father, who tried to understand Samantha's emotional turmoil. He would approach her calmly, sit beside her on the sofa, and ask how she was. And for a while that was enough for Samantha not to feel completely alone. But even Ryan, with his serene smile, couldn't contain the tensions that were building between him and Mark. The Larkins' house, which at first seemed like a safe haven, was now turning into a silent battlefield. Samantha didn't know who to trust. Ryan seemed like a shelter, but at the same time, she realized that he was losing the battle to Mark. The contrast between the two fathers seemed to grow every day. And when Samantha looked at them, she no longer saw two united men, but two strangers, separated by something she couldn't understand. It was on a Saturday morning that everything changed. Samantha woke up with a feeling of weight on her chest. Something was wrong. She already knew that that day would be different. When she went downstairs for breakfast, she found Mark in a state of extreme nervousness. His eyes were restless, and his voice, usually calm, was now filled with tension. "Samantha, how about spending the afternoon in your room studying? I don't want to see you wandering around the house doing nothing," Mark said, without looking directly at her. The order sounded more like a muffled scream. She tried to protest, but Mark wouldn't let her speak. "I'm not asking, I'm telling you. You need discipline. You're going to learn to be someone for real, or none of this is going to work." The weight of the word discipline sounded like a sentence. Samantha swallowed the pain rising in her throat. She didn't understand why Mark was acting like this, why he was so unyielding. But even without words, she obeyed. She went upstairs to her room, locked herself inside, and spent the afternoon in silence, listening to Mark's shouts, now directed at Ryan. They were arguing, and Samantha could only hear the muffled echoes of a conversation that seemed to have no end. She sat on the bed and picked up the book she had started reading days earlier, but Samantha's mind was distant. She couldn't concentrate. The tension in the house consumed everything, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. Samantha was no longer sure if this place, this house, was still hers. That night, when Ryan came looking for her, she looked at him with eyes that were beginning to lose hope. He seemed concerned, but didn't know how to comfort her. They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy. "Samantha, you know we love you, right?" Ryan asked, his voice soft, like it was both an affirmation and an attempt to believe there was still space for hope. She shook her head, but couldn't answer. She wasn't sure anymore if that love was what she needed. She wasn't sure if she could trust Mark, who seemed more distant and unpredictable every day. The idea of having a family seemed to be dissolving like smoke. She didn't know how to react, how to find a path between the two men who, although they loved her, were so divided between each other. That night Samantha fell asleep with a lump in her throat. She felt her new life crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. What had once seemed like the beginning of a fairy tale now felt like an endless story, full of chapters she no longer wanted to read. The change was happening, and Samantha didn't know if she would survive it. What she didn't realize was that the fight for peace in that house would only be the beginning of something much bigger, something that would challenge her limits of resilience and courage. And, like in every good story, the biggest twist would come when she least expected it. The atmosphere in the Larkins' house began to change so gradually that Samantha took a while to notice. At first, Mark's pressure on her seemed like a phase, something that would soon be resolved. But the weeks passed, and Mark's behavior not only didn't improve, but grew more intense. He seemed to have a more critical eye for everything Samantha did. If she left a dirty dish in the sink, it was an example of sloppiness. If she forgot to make the bed, she was called lazy. And no matter how much Samantha tried to accept the constant criticism, the pressure made her chest tighten, as if with each passing day she was being consumed by an expectation she couldn't meet. Everything seemed wrong, or rather it always seemed to be her fault. But what bothered her the most was the coldness with which Mark treated the little things. The first time Samantha dared to comment on the difficulty of dealing with so many rules, Mark responded impersonally. "I'm not here to be your friend, Samantha. I'm here to teach you how to be a real person." Those words stayed engraved in her mind. She didn't know what being a real person meant, but what she did know was that it made her feel like she was doing something wrong, like she wasn't good enough. While Mark continued with his harsh and inflexible stance, Ryan tried to mediate situations, always trying to ease the tension, always with a smile that couldn't hide his concern. He would pull her aside, speak to her calmly, and try to encourage her passions, but even he seemed to be losing his patience. He also couldn't understand Mark's behavior, but felt powerless in the face of his partner's strength. What had once seemed like a house full of hope, of a promising beginning, was now full of gaps and uncertainties. Samantha no longer knew who to trust. Mark, more and more fickle, seemed capable of exploding with anger without warning, and Ryan, who tried to be the safe haven, now found himself cornered, afraid of losing Mark's trust, and with it the stability of the relationship he cherished so much. The limit seemed to be approaching. One day, Samantha locked herself in the bathroom after an especially intense argument between the two men. She heard Mark's words cutting through the air, sharp and quick, and felt her heart race. "You can't keep protecting her, Ryan. She won't learn anything if you keep treating her like a baby. It's time to toughen up with her." The words echoed in her mind, like a scream that repeated itself over and over. It was that night that she decided to do something she wasn't even sure was right, but that, at that moment, seemed like the only way to find some clarity. She grabbed her hidden phone and, with trembling hands, searched for answers, for other cases, for stories of people who, like her, felt helpless within their own home. What she found were accounts of teenagers dealing with abusive parents, with rigid expectations they couldn't meet. The words she read haunted her. The stories spoke of the pressure to please, of the pain of being constantly judged. When silence fell in the house, Samantha went downstairs to the kitchen. Mark was sitting at the table, frowning. Ryan was on the couch with tired eyes. The atmosphere was heavier than ever. She looked at both of them, not knowing what to do. Ryan gave a slight smile, but his eyes revealed the fatigue. He was lost, seemingly unsure of how to deal with Mark anymore. She realized that between them there was a thin line separating love from frustration. "I don't know how to deal with this anymore, Ryan," Samantha murmured, sitting down next to him. Ryan looked at her, his eyes full of a sadness she couldn't fully understand. He knew the situation was becoming unsustainable, but at the same time he felt helpless. He too was losing the ability to intervene. "I know, Sam," he answered softly. "I know, but sometimes I can't talk to him anymore. I don't know what happened, but he's so different." Samantha felt the weight of those words. Even Ryan was beginning to doubt everything that had once seemed right. But what she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. And when Mark entered the room with a stern expression and cold eyes, she knew that something would have to change. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm about to break. "I told you I wouldn't tolerate this anymore, Ryan," Mark said in an eerily calm tone. "It's time to make a decision, or this house is going to split in half." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what that meant, but she knew she was at the center of something she couldn't control. And at that moment, the pressure on her shoulders felt unbearable. She wished she could disappear, but she knew that somewhere inside she would have to make a decision that would change everything. That night, after another heated argument, Samantha went to bed with the feeling that the house was no longer a home. The love she had longed for seemed to be disintegrating before her eyes, and she didn't know what to do to stop what seemed to be an irreversible process. The silence in the house was unbearable. It was as if all the everyday noises had been absorbed by the growing tension, and the mere sound of a door closing felt like an announcement of an impending disaster. Samantha didn't know how to deal with the emotions that overwhelmed her, but the sense of being lost only intensified. She no longer recognized the house that was supposed to be her refuge. That afternoon, she was alone in her room, trying to focus on a history lesson, but her mind couldn't stray from the chaos that seemed to be taking over her life. The sound of the front door slamming made her get up. She knew Mark was home, and his presence always brought a sense of alertness. But something was different. Something was about to happen. She slowly descended the stairs, her heart beating faster with every step. The conversation between the two dads was in a low tone, but as always Mark's words seemed to be at a much higher volume inside her. She didn't want to listen, but she couldn't avoid it. "I can't take it any more, Ryan," Mark said with a tone of restrained anger. "You're blinding everything because of her. You're making me look like the villain, when in reality I'm the one trying to keep this house running. Mark, it's not like that. I know you're going through a lot, but you need to understand that Sam, she needs space, time. You can't just impose everything on her like this." Ryan's voice was tense, but he still tried to soften his words. He seemed to be struggling not to lose his patience, but Mark didn't want to hear it. "You always have an excuse for her. Always. You're never on my side, never see what's going on. She's getting worse, Ryan, and you don't want to see that." Samantha stopped at the base of the stairs, feeling the weight of the words as if they had been thrown directly at her. Each one felt like a blow, a reflection of an image she was beginning to fear. Being the one to blame for everything, she could no longer tell what was right or wrong. She just knew the tension between her two dads was becoming unbearable. Then, almost suddenly, Mark exploded. He suddenly stood up, pushing the chair back with a sharp motion. Samantha jumped back, her body on alert, feeling the wave of anger invade the room. "I can't be the villain here anymore, Ryan. I'm the only one who really cares. You're weak, always weak. And this house is about to fall apart because of that." Ryan, visibly shaken, tried to approach Mark, but something in his posture seemed to have broken. "Mark, calm down." "You're losing control," he said, trying to reach his partner. But the words had no effect. Mark shoved Ryan away, making Samantha step back in shock. Mark's anger was out of control, and his aggressive behavior seemed to have taken over him irreversibly. Samantha didn't know what to do. She felt paralyzed, as if everything around her was falling apart, and she was at the center of it all. She looked at Ryan, hoping to see some sense of safety, but his gaze was empty, without answers, without the strength to confront Mark. Then Samantha did something she didn't expect. She ran into the room and shouted, "Enough!" Her voice came out louder than she had imagined, but there was no holding back the explosion of emotions that flooded her. The two men looked at her, surprised. Mark was furious, muscles tense, face red, but something in his eyes seemed to hesitate. Ryan seemed to be searching for something within himself, but didn't know what to do. "You're not listening to me?" Samantha continued, her voice trembling. "You're fighting each other, and I'm in the middle of it all. I'm not to blame for everything. I just wanted to be accepted. But now I don't even know where I am. I'm not at home anymore. I'm not anyone's daughter here." Mark stared at her for a moment, as if trying to understand her words. But instead of calm, the tension only grew. He stepped toward Samantha, his gaze fixed, and the girl stepped back, feeling a mix of fear and anger. You don't know what it's like to be responsible for a house." Mark yelled. "You think it's easy. You think it's simple. You don't know anything." Samantha felt the weight of those words, as if they were sharp knives cutting through every bit of her confidence. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Then Ryan intervened in a way she didn't expect. He stepped between her and Mark, a hard expression on his face. "Enough, Mark. I'm not going to let you do this to her. I'm not going to let you destroy what's left of this family." Samantha looked at Ryan, feeling a mix of relief and surprise. He was finally taking action, but the tension in the air was still palpable. What had once seemed like a simple fight between two men now seemed to be the end of something she never thought possible. The end of her family, and yet, deep in her heart, she knew some change was necessary. They needed to find each other somewhere. They all needed to find each other. The following silence was so deep it seemed to swallow everything around them. Mark was there, standing still with his gaze fixed on Ryan. But his words seemed to echo in Samantha's mind. She knew something had changed there. The image of the family she had longed for was breaking apart before her eyes. Ryan looked at her, his expression closed, but something in his eyes indicated he was completely lost in a sea of doubts. Samantha couldn't understand how everything had gotten to this point. Before this, everything seemed so simple. She had a new chance to be happy, to finally have a home, a family. But now everything felt like a big lie. What could she do? Mark seemed to notice the intensity of Samantha's gaze, and for a brief moment something in his expression changed. He stepped away from Ryan, going to the living room window. Samantha could see the tense movement of his shoulders as he looked outside, as if he wanted to distance himself from the situation, but the weight of the words still hung in the air. "You're destroying me, Ryan," Mark said, without looking at him, but with a voice trembling from lingering anger. "I never wanted this. I just wanted our life to be normal." "Normal?" Ryan replied, incredulity taking over his voice. "Mark, we both know that word never made sense to us. We can't have a normal life if we don't know how to deal with what's really happening. This isn't about Sam, it's about both of us. What are we doing with our relationship?" Mark let out a deep sigh, and Samantha noticed he was starting to regain control. But the frustration still lingered. She knew he was fighting something inside, but she didn't know what it was. Over the months she had lived with them, she had seen Ryan's love for Mark, but she also felt there was something hidden, an invisible tension spreading. "I don't know what you want me to do, Ryan," Mark continued, his voice lower but the anger still palpable. "You're saying you're destroying me? What about me? Don't I have the right to be happy too? What do you think this life is doing to me? I just want control. I'm losing it, Ryan. I'm losing the reason to be." Those words felt like a blow. Samantha felt a physical pain in her chest. Control? Be happy? How could Mark talk about that when all she wanted was just to feel part of something that loved her unconditionally? But now, with the growing distance between them, all that remained was a vast emptiness, a farce of a family. Ryan, for his part, could no longer hold back. He took a step forward, his body trembling with frustration. "You can't keep doing this, Mark. You can't put all the blame on me. You can't ignore what's happening with her. She needs us, not a warrior trying to assert himself on top of her. The tension took over every word. Samantha, unable to stay quiet any longer, screamed again, this time with a tone of desperation she didn't even know she had. "I'm not the one to blame. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, stop fighting. I just wanted things to be different." Her voice broke, and a wave of emotions exploded in her chest. Mark looked at her, and this time his gaze wasn't filled with anger, but with deep sadness. He approached slowly, but didn't touch her. "Samantha," he started, his voice soft, but still marked by pain. "I know you're suffering, but I don't know how to handle this anymore. I don't know how to help." Ryan also approached, placing his hand on Samantha's shoulder. "We'll find a way, daughter. I swear we will. Just don't give up on us." But even with Ryan's words, Samantha no longer knew what to do. She felt the weight of guilt, but also the pain of not being able to fit into the world Mark and Ryan were trying to build. She felt that the house, which once seemed welcoming and full of possibilities, had now become a prison where no one could understand each other. What once felt like shelter now seemed to be crumbling. What would happen now? Samantha felt that nothing would ever be the same. The snap of the door opening made everyone stop. Mark and Ryan looked toward the entrance, and Samantha, on impulse, turned as well. There was Carolyn, Samantha's friend, who had come to visit, but her expression was not the usual one. Carolyn looked visibly concerned. She looked at the three of them, and the weight of the moment seemed to pass from one to another. "Samantha, what's going on?" Carolyn asked, her voice soft but curious. Before Samantha could answer, Mark looked at her, now with a tense expression, and then, almost unwillingly, the truth began to seep into the conversation. He spoke not with anger, but with a sadness that Samantha couldn't fully comprehend. "I'm losing my patience, Carolyn, and I know that's not right, but I don't know how to handle this. I don't know how to be the father she needs anymore." The revelation was a punch to Samantha's stomach. That word, father, which she had longed to hear naturally, now seemed to be ripped from his mouth, as if it were no longer true. Not because he wasn't her father, but because he was so lost in his own fears and frustrations that he could no longer be what she needed. And there, in those words, Samantha felt the weight of the decision she would have to make, the weight of realizing that a family wasn't something that was ready-made. It wasn't a promise of perfection. It was indeed a constant struggle. But she didn't know if she was more prepared for the fight than for the pain of having to decide who she wanted the father to be. The following morning was filled with a heavy silence. Samantha woke up with the weight of the previous night still on her mind, a constant pressure that seemed to want to crush her chest. Mark and Ryan's words, their frustrated looks, were still echoing in her head. The sense of not belonging spread like a shadow she couldn't shake off. And once again she found herself in the middle of it all, torn between the love she had begun to build for her parents and the pain of broken promises. She walked down the stairs slowly, finding Ryan sitting at the dining table, distractedly stirring his coffee. He no longer seemed like the strong and confident man he once was, but a broken man, his eyes empty of hope. Mark, on the other hand, was in the garden, his arms crossed, staring into the horizon with a furrowed brow, as if trying to understand his own pain before facing it. Samantha sat in the chair across from Ryan, and he looked at her with softness in his gaze, but also with a deep fatigue. The silence between them was uncomfortable, but no longer threatening as it had been before. Now it was a silence full of expectations. What would come next? "Samantha," Ryan began, his voice soft but laden with emotion. I know yesterday was difficult, really difficult for all of us. I didn't expect things to get this far, but I want you to know that I still want to be your father. I want to be the person you can trust, the one who will protect you. I just don't know how to do it right. Please forgive me." Samantha watched him for a long moment. It was hard to believe his words after everything that had happened. But seeing his vulnerability, the way he tried to explain himself without imposing anything, she realized there was still something there, something worth fighting for. I don't know how to do this either, Ryan," Samantha said, her voice trembling. "I just wanted things to be different. I just wanted to feel that you were okay, that we would be happy together. But it feels like it's not like that." Ryan sighed, running his hand over his face as if trying to cool his thoughts. "I know, and sometimes things don't go as planned. But we'll try, Samantha. If you give me a chance, I'll try to be the father you deserve. I'll do everything I can." Samantha felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being disappointed again was in every fiber of her being. She didn't know if she should trust this moment, this space of vulnerability they were trying to create. But when she looked at Ryan, she saw something he had never shown before, a real attempt to be someone better, someone she could trust. Meanwhile, Mark was outside, arms still crossed, but something in his face showed that he was lost in a whirlwind of feelings. He hadn't been able to see the pain reflected in Samantha's eyes. He hadn't known how to handle the pressure of being a father. Without realizing it, he had been turning his pain into distance, and this was deeply affecting the relationship he could have had with Samantha. When Mark walked into the kitchen, the air felt even heavier. He looked at Samantha and Ryan, and a palpable tension hung between the three of them. It was clear that Mark's words the night before were still burning. His inner struggle was written on his face. He knew he needed to take a step toward Samantha, but his pride and fear of exposing himself were blocking his action. "Samantha," Mark began, his voice firm, but without the authority he once had. I don't know what else to say. I don't want to lose you. I don't want you to think this is your fault, because it's not." Samantha looked at him, her heart beating faster. What did he want now? She didn't know. What had he done to the figure she thought he was? What was happening with the parents who were crumbling before her eyes? I just don't understand," she said, the words coming out like a wave of frustration. "Why don't you try to be the father I need, Mark? I don't understand you." That cry, though soft, cut through the silence. Mark looked at her with a look of pain and regret, and for the first time since they had met, he felt weak. He hadn't known how to be the father Samantha wanted. He had known how to be a friend, a life partner, but not a father. And this tore him apart in a way he didn't know how to face. "I don't know how to do this, Samantha," he said, his voice broken. I just wanted us to be a normal family, to have the chance to start over. But I don't know how to deal with all of this. I don't know how to deal with you." It was as if in that moment the weight of words he had never said before finally came out, as if the truth, as painful as it was now laid open between them. Samantha, looking at him, began to feel a mix of anger and sadness. She wanted a strong father, someone who would hold her firmly, someone who knew what to do. But there in front of her was Mark, a man who was trying but also failing. He was in the same place as her, lost and trying to find the way, but perhaps this was the way. Not the way of a perfect father, but the way of a father who tries, who fails, and who rises again. Samantha still didn't know if she could forgive everything, but something was starting to change inside her. She still needed time. They still needed time. "I don't know what will happen to us," she said, her voice calmer now, "but maybe we can try, one day at a time." Mark and Ryan exchanged a look, and in that glance, something shifted. They were no longer perfect parents, but human parents, and maybe that was enough. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple, when Samantha noticed something she hadn't seen before. Time was passing, and with it, she too was changing. Sitting on the porch, legs crossed, a book open in front of her, she watched Ryan and Mark working together in the garden. Something in the way they interacted now seemed more peaceful, more natural. They were no longer as distant nor as tense as before. There was a lightness that had once seemed impossible. The night before was still fresh in her memory, but it didn't seem as overwhelming anymore. It had been hard. Very hard, but something in her was changing, something she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, she was seeing her parents truly trying to be better for her, and, most importantly, for themselves. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were there, ready to face whatever came. Together, Samantha felt the soft breeze of the afternoon on her face and closed her eyes for a moment. A timid peace began to emerge in her heart. It wasn't a complete peace, not yet, but it was a peace she knew she could nurture. It was a chance to build something new, something she never thought she'd have. A family. Not a perfect family, but a real family. The next day the house seemed different. Mark and Ryan were there, talking about what they needed to improve and organizing the household tasks. It seemed simple, but it was a big step. Samantha was with them, sitting at the table, watching her parents communicate in a healthier way. They were learning to listen to each other more, to respect each other on a deeper level. It was as if the weight of the previous night had been necessary to break the barriers that separated them. Mark, with a shy smile, approached Samantha, who was in the kitchen trying to decide what to make for lunch. "Hey, do you want to help me make dinner tonight? I know you love to cook." Samantha looked at him, surprised by the invitation. She hadn't expected that. It was always her who tried to make things work, who tried to please, but now he was there, offering help, reaching out in a new way. "Sure," she replied, with a hesitant smile. "I'd love to." As they prepared dinner, Ryan appeared at the kitchen door, watching the interaction between the two. He smiled, but his eyes showed a deep concern, as if what was happening was fragile, something that needed constant care. But he knew that was how life worked, step by step. They couldn't change everything at once, but they could try together. Night fell, and with it a sense of contentment and hope. The meal was simple, but delicious, and the atmosphere at the table was lighter than ever. Samantha looked at her parents, and something inside her warmed. It wasn't the family of her dreams, but it was a family she was starting to accept, a family that, despite its imperfections, loved her in its own way. After dinner, while Ryan and Mark washed the dishes, Samantha went outside to the garden, where she sat in the same chair she had been in days ago, immersed in a sea of lonely thoughts. Now the sky was clear, and she could hear the soft sounds of the night, the crickets singing and the light breeze rustling the leaves of the trees. She looked at the starry sky and realized that maybe she was beginning to find her place. It wasn't something grand or immediate. It was a small step, but it was a step in the right direction, a step toward a future she still couldn't fully visualize, but that now seemed more accessible, more tangible. "I don't know what the future holds for us," she whispered to herself, "but I think I can start believing that maybe it's okay not to know. Maybe what matters is what we're building here." Now, the sound of footsteps behind her made her turn her head. Ryan was approaching with a tired but genuine smile. He sat next to her, and for a moment the two of them sat there in silence. They didn't need words. The silence was full of understanding. Samantha felt the weight of his presence, but now, in a comforting way, she wasn't alone. "I'm trying, Samantha," Ryan said, his voice calm. "I know we still have a lot to learn, but I'm trying." She smiled for the first time with a genuine smile. "I'm trying too." And in that moment, she knew that even though the road ahead was long, she wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone anymore. The future was uncertain, full of ups and downs, but for the first time, Samantha felt that maybe she had found the place where she truly belonged, a place where love wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for now, that was enough.